On January 10th, 2018, Devlin Stringfellow walked onto the exercise yard at California State Prison, Sacramento. He was 48 years old, a co-founder of Public Enemy Number One, a man who had helped build one of Southern California's most notorious white gangs from the chaos of the punk scene into something much darker. And he was close to freedom. After decades moving through the prison system, after drug charges, weapons cases, and gang enhancements, Stringfellow was looking at release in 2020. 2 more years. That was all that stood between him and the outside world. But on that yard, history did not protect him. Two inmates approached. Within minutes, Stringfellow was dying on the concrete. To prison officials, the motive was unclear. But to people who understood the Aryan Brotherhood, the message was not confusing at all. Public Enemy Number One had once believed it was independent. By 2018, it belonged to something bigger. And when a prison empire decides you are a liability, even a founder can become disposable. How does a gang go from punk rock rebellion to dying under orders from the very system it thought it could survive? To answer that, you have to go back to Long Beach, before the prison yards, before the federal indictments, before the door closed for good. Long before Public Enemy Number One became a prison gang asset, it looked like something much smaller, much louder, and much harder to define. Southern California in the mid-1980s had its own kind of underground electricity. In Long Beach, Huntington Beach, and the surrounding suburbs, young people were finding identity in noise, anger, and speed. Hardcore punk was not polished, it was not polite. It was bodies crashing into bodies, guitars screaming through bad speakers, sweat on concrete floors, and teenagers trying to turn confusion into something that felt like power. For many of them, the scene was a place to belong, not because it was safe, because it understood rage. Inside places like Fender's Ballroom, the music was fast, the crowds were violent, and the line between performance and real-world aggression was thin. Black Flag, Descendants, Bad Religion, and other bands gave the scene its sound. But around that sound, something else was moving too. Methamphetamine, cocaine, PCP, street fights, racial resentment, and young men looking for an identity strong enough to cover the emptiness underneath. That was the world where P9 began to form. At first, Public Enemy Number One was not an empire. It was not a sophisticated criminal network. It was a cluster of young white men pulled together by music, anger, drugs, and the need to be recognized. They borrowed symbols, postures, and attitudes from the punk and skinhead worlds. They wanted to look untouchable before they had any real power at all. That is how many dangerous groups begin, not with a master plan, with a feeling that the outside world does not respect you, a feeling that nobody is listening, a feeling that if you make enough noise, scare enough people, and stand together under one name, you might finally become someone. But rebellion without direction can be captured. And in Southern California, the things waiting to capture it were already there. Meth, violence, racial ideology, and the promise that fear could become status. For a while, the gang still wore the costume of rebellion, the music, the attitude, the anti-everything posture. But slowly, the center shifted. The stage became less important than the street. The pit became less important than the crew. The idea of freedom began to blur into the desire for control. That was the first tragedy of P9. They thought they were rejecting the system, but they were already building a smaller, uglier system of their own. And once that happened, the music could no longer contain what they were becoming. The first corruption did not happen all at once. Public Enemy Number One did not wake up one morning as a structured criminal organization. It drifted there step by step through the same forces that had surrounded it from the beginning: drugs, violence, reputation, and young men confusing fear with respect. In the beginning, the punk scene gave them a stage. The street gave them something else. It gave them status. A reputation could grow faster through violence than through music. One fight could travel through a neighborhood faster than one song. One act of brutality could make a name feel larger than it really was. And for a group of young men hungry to be feared, that lesson was dangerous. Scott Miller became one of the early examples of how violence could transform status inside the scene. After he shot the leader of a rival group, his reputation changed almost overnight. To people already circling the edge of skinhead culture, He was no longer just another angry kid from the scene. He became proof that violence could create mythology. That kind of mythology spreads fast. Soon, Public Enemy Number One was no longer just a group attached to punk shows. It was becoming a crew with its own internal hierarchy, its own expectations, and its own criminal direction. Two figures came to represent that transformation: Devlin Gazoo Stringfellow and Donald Popeye Massa. Stringfellow carried the history of the gang's early days. Massa saw the future differently. Inside P9, there were competing visions. Some wanted ideology, racial propaganda, and a movement built around white supremacist beliefs. Others cared less about leaflets and more about money. Crime was faster. Meth was everywhere. Theft was profitable. Identity fraud offered a way to make cash without always depending on street-level violence. And in that split, money won. P9 moved deeper into organized crime. Members robbed homes, moved drugs, and built identity theft operations that made the gang more useful and more dangerous. They learned that personal information could be stolen like property. Mailboxes, trash, bank records, credit profiles, paperwork, all of it became currency. Women connected to the gang were often used as tools in that system. Girlfriends and wives could get jobs or access in places where tattooed gang members could not. Banks, mortgage companies, offices, motor vehicle systems, anywhere information lived became a target. The gang did not just need muscle anymore, it needed access. That was the moment P9 became something more organized than a violent scene. It became infrastructure, and infrastructure attracts predators. By the 1990s, P9 had moved beyond its Long Beach roots and deeper into Orange County and the wider Southern California criminal world. It recruited from white suburban neighborhoods, pulling in young men who were bored, angry, addicted, or desperate to belong to something that looked powerful. But the more P9 grew, the more its members entered prison. And prison changed the meaning of power. On the street, P9 could act independent. It could build its own name, make its own money, and scare people under its own flag. Inside California's prison system, that flag meant much less, because there was already an older power waiting there, a power that did not care where P9 came from, only whether P9 could be used. The moment P9 members started entering California prisons, the rules changed. On the street, a gang can build its own identity. It can choose its colors, its enemies, its reputation, and the mythology it wants outsiders to believe. It can act as if the world begins and ends with the name it has created for itself. But prison is different. Prison already has a map. A yard is not just concrete and fences. It is territory. It is history. It is race politics, alliances, debts, old murders, old grudges, and rules enforced by people who may never raise their voices before giving an order that changes someone's life. Every table, every phone, every workout area, every hallway has meaning. And inside that world, Public Enemy Number One was not walking into empty space. It was walking into someone else's system. At the top of the white inmate power structure stood the Aryan Brotherhood, an organization older, colder, and far more disciplined than anything P9 had built on the street. The Brotherhood did not need to be the largest group to be the most feared. Its power came from reputation, loyalty, violence, and the ability to make other white gangs understand their place beneath it. For P9 members, this created a brutal reality. The same men who had acted like predators outside became assets inside. If they were useful, they could be protected. If they were disobedient, they could be punished. If they showed potential, they could be recruited. But independence was not guaranteed simply because they had a name. In prison, a name only mattered if the people above you allowed it to matter. That is where the illusion began to break. P9 had imagined itself as an outlaw identity, a crew that answered to itself. But in California prisons, white gangs did not exist in a vacuum. They existed inside a hierarchy shaped by the Aryan Brotherhood. The Brotherhood had learned how to survive isolation, crackdowns, and decades of law enforcement pressure by using layers of influence. When leaders were locked away, they used messengers. When direct contact became dangerous, they used coded communication. When their own members could not move freely, they used other gangs. That made P9 valuable, not respected in the way it wanted to be respected. Valuable. There is a difference. Respect suggests equality. Value suggests usefulness. And the Aryan Brotherhood did not look at P9 as an equal. It looked at P9 as a resource. Men on the yards, men on the streets, men with drug connections, men who could move money, men who still had access to places lockdown prison leaders could not reach. That is how independence ends in a world like this. Not always with a war. Sometimes it ends with protection. Sometimes it ends with status. Sometimes it ends with the stronger organization telling you that you now matter, while quietly taking ownership of everything that made you useful. P9 entered prison thinking its reputation would follow it inside. But prison did not care about the legend P9 had built in Long Beach or Orange County. Prison had its own legend, and that legend wore the shamrock. The Aryan Brotherhood did not need to destroy public enemy number one. That would have been too simple. A weaker organization fights every rival it sees. A smarter organization studies what a rival can provide, then decides whether that rival should be crushed, ignored, or turned into a tool. And by the early 2000s, P9 was too useful to ignore. It had street reach. It had drug connections. It had identity theft money. It had young white members moving in and out of custody. It had people who could still operate in places where confirmed Aryan Brotherhood members could not. That last point mattered most. For years, prison officials had tried to weaken the Aryan Brotherhood by isolating its most dangerous leaders. Put them in secure housing, cut off their contact, keep them locked down for 23 hours a day, remove them from the general population, and limit their ability to influence the yards. On paper, it made sense. If the leaders cannot move, the organization should weaken. But prison gangs adapt. The Aryan Brotherhood learned how to operate through layers. If senior members could not walk the yard, someone else could. If they could not meet suppliers, someone else could. If they could not collect debts, move drugs, punish enemies, or pass instructions directly, then proxies could do it for them. That is where groups like P9 became valuable. They were not yet locked down the same way. They had freedom of movement inside some facilities. They had people outside prison. They had networks in Southern California. And they had something even more useful than money: young members desperate for status. The Brotherhood understood that desire. It did not always have to force obedience through fear. Sometimes it could offer elevation, protection, recognition, the possibility of being seen as more than just another street gang member, the promise of standing closer to the most feared white prison organization in America. That promise was bait, and once accepted, it came with ownership. P9 members could believe they were gaining protection, but protection in that world was never free. The cost was service. Carry this message, move this package, collect this debt, handle this problem, prove loyalty, do not ask too many questions, do not act independent when the order comes from above. That is how the takeover worked. Not as a single announcement, not as a public surrender, but as 1,000 small exchanges where status replaced freedom and protection became control. The Aryan Brotherhood had used similar systems before. When one proxy group became too visible or too restricted, another could take its place. It was not only a gang structure, it was a supply chain of violence and obedience. Street crews fed prison crews fed leadership. Leadership stayed insulated while younger, lower-level men carried the risk. P9 became part of that chain. To outsiders, it could still look like public enemy number one was operating under its own name. The tattoos, the reputation, the history, the mythology, all of it still existed. But inside the prison system, names can become masks. A gang can keep its old flag while serving a new master. And that is what made the takeover so effective. P9 did not have to disappear for the Aryan Brotherhood to own it. It only had to answer when called. And once a gang starts answering to someone else, the question is no longer whether it is independent. The question is how long it will take before the members realize they have been purchased. Donald Popeye Massa was not just another member of public enemy number one. He was one of the men who helped shape what P9 became. In the beginning, that meant influence. It meant reputation. It meant being part of the group's identity before the rest of the world fully understood what the name would come to represent. But influence can become a trap when a leader walks into a larger system and mistakes recognition for power. Mazza entered prison with a name behind him. Inside P9, he mattered. Inside the Aryan Brotherhood's world, that made him useful. He had history. He had connections. He had credibility with men who already followed the P9 flag. If he could be pulled closer to the Brotherhood, then P9 itself could be pulled closer. A founder does not only bring his own loyalty, he brings the symbolic weight of everyone who once believed in him. That is why his path matters so much. When Maza was invited into the Aryan Brotherhood, it may have looked like an elevation. In that world, the shamrock was not just a symbol, it was status, fear, protection, and danger all wrapped into one. For someone coming from a street gang, being accepted by the Brotherhood could feel like confirmation that he had reached a higher level. But the higher level was not freedom, it was commitment. The Aryan Brotherhood did not operate like a club someone could leave when the cost became too high. Its code was built around permanence. Blood in, blood out. Once inside, a man did not simply retire, distance himself, or quietly return to normal life. Every favor created a debt. Every order tested loyalty. Every moment of hesitation could be interpreted as betrayal. By joining, Maza did more than change his own status. He opened a door. Through him, P9 became more deeply connected to the Brotherhood's prison hierarchy. Members could be used. Street networks could be tapped. The old identity of public enemy number one could continue on the surface while its real purpose changed underneath. This is one of the most dangerous forms of takeover. No one has to announce it. No one has to replace the name. No one has to remove the old leaders from the photographs. The organization simply begins to answer upward. And once it does, the meaning of loyalty changes. Loyalty to P9 becomes loyalty to the Brotherhood. Loyalty to the Brotherhood becomes obedience to orders that may have nothing to do with the old gang's original purpose. The group that once thought it had its own direction becomes a corridor through which someone else's power moves. For Matza, that door would eventually become a cage. He would later try to live cleaner, to move away from the old life, to create distance from the violence that had defined so much of his past. But distance is not the same as escape. In the Brotherhood's world, a man with history is never fully released from it. He can be called back. He can be tested again. He can be ordered to prove that the old oath still owns him. That was the hidden cost of the status he accepted. Maza may have thought he was stepping into power, but in truth, he was stepping into a system where even founders could become instruments, and even instruments could be thrown away. Ronald Dean Yandel showed what the Aryan Brotherhood could become when prison walls failed to contain prison power. For years, Yandel had been held under some of the harshest restrictions California could impose. Segregated housing was supposed to cut men like him off from influence. 23 hours a day in a small cell. Limited movement, limited contact, limited access to the outside world. The idea was simple. If a man could orchestrate violence, isolate him until his voice could no longer travel. But isolation does not always destroy power. Sometimes it only teaches power how to move differently. When Yandel was eventually transferred out of long-term isolation and into a less restricted prison environment, the system believed it was managing a legal and constitutional problem. What prosecutors later alleged was something much darker, that he used new access, contacts, and a contraband cell phone to help rebuild influence from inside prison. That phone mattered, not because it was advanced, because it erased distance. With a phone, a man behind concrete could reach people on the street. He could speak to associates, coordinate movement, discuss money, maintain pressure, and make men outside prison feel as if the cell door had not weakened him at all. The prison had his body, but the network still carried his voice. That is the nightmare of modern prison gangs. The state can lock down a person, but if the network remains alive, the person can become a signal. Orders move outward, fear moves outward, reputation moves outward. And the men receiving those signals often carry the physical risk for leaders who are already serving long sentences. According to federal prosecutors, Yandel wanted more than survival. He wanted consolidation. He wanted a stronger Aryan Brotherhood presence, a new wave of hardened soldiers, in a structure where other white gangs understood that resistance came with consequences. In that strategy, P9 and groups like it were not partners in any equal sense. They were extensions. Arms reaching out from a prison empire that could not physically leave the prison, but could still touch the streets through other people. This is why Public Enemy Number One's loss of independence mattered. The gang had once been loud, chaotic, and tied to a youth scene that imagined itself outside the rules. But under the Brotherhood's influence, that chaos was shaped into service. The members who wanted recognition could be offered a path. The members who wanted protection could be made dependent. The members who wanted status could be pushed toward acts that proved obedience. And the more the system worked, the more invisible the real command became. A young man on the street might think he was acting for his own gang. A prisoner on a yard might think he was earning his own name. But above them, someone else was deciding what their violence was worth. That is the cold genius of a proxy empire. It does not require every soldier to understand the whole war. It only requires each one to obey the order in front of him. And by the time Yendel's name appeared in federal allegations, the picture was clear. The Aryan Brotherhood was not only surviving inside prison, it was projecting power outward. Through phones, through fear, through ambition, through men who believed service would make them important. But every empire that rules by messages eventually needs one message so loud that no one can ignore it. And in California's prison yards, that message would be written in blood. A prison yard can look simple from the outside. Concrete, fences, guard towers, men walking in circles under the sun. But inside the politics of a prison gang, the yard is more than open space. It is a stage. It is where rumors are confirmed, where fear is displayed, where one act can speak louder than 100 threats whispered through cells and phones. The Aryan Brotherhood understood that better than almost anyone. A private warning can control one man. A public killing can control an entire population. That was the purpose of message violence. It was not only about removing a target, it was about teaching everyone watching what the rules were, who owned the yard, and what happened to people who stood outside the chain of command. One of the clearest examples came with Hugo Yogi Pinell. By the time he was attacked in 2015, Pinell was already an infamous figure in California prison history, tied to the San Quentin Six and decades of prison conflict. For years, he had lived under heavy security because prison officials knew he had enemies. But when long-term isolation policies changed and old enemies began entering general population again, the past came with them. Pinell's death was not only the killing of one old prisoner, it was a signal. According to federal allegations, men seeking Aryan Brotherhood status carried out the attack as a way to prove themselves and send a message. The yard erupted afterward, and the violence showed exactly how fragile prison order could be when hidden gang politics broke into the open. For groups like P9, the lesson was impossible to miss. The Aryan Brotherhood was not simply giving orders from the shadows. It could turn the prison yard into a billboard. And then came Devlin Stringfellow. Stringfellow was different because he was not just another target. He was a founder. He carried the memory of what Public Enemy Number One had been before it became tied to something larger. He represented the old P9, louder, messier, more independent, more rooted in the gang's original identity. But in the world P9 had entered, history did not guarantee safety. By 2018, Stringfellow was close to release, but closeness to freedom can make a man more visible. He had a reputation for talking too much, drawing attention, acting as if his founder status still protected him. In a system built on silence, that was dangerous. So when he walked onto the yard at California State Prison, Sacramento, he was not walking into a neutral space. He was walking into a place where the past had already been judged. 2 inmates moved toward him. The attack was fast. The message lasted much longer. To the outside, it could be reported as another prison killing with an unclear motive. But inside that world, the meaning was sharper. If a founder could be touched, anyone could be touched. If history did not protect Stringfellow, it would not protect anyone beneath him. That is the reality of being absorbed by a stronger criminal empire. You may keep your name. You may keep your tattoos. You may keep the old stories about who started what. But if someone else can decide whether you live, then the old ownership is gone. Stringfellow's death was not only the end of a man, it was the clearest proof that Public Enemy Number One no longer belonged to itself. Donald Popeye Massa had already watched the old world collapse. Public Enemy Number One had lost its independence. Devlin Stringfellow was dead. The Aryan Brotherhood had turned the gang's street network, reputation, and history into something useful for a larger prison empire. And Matza, one of the men who helped open that door, eventually found himself trapped inside the same system he had helped strengthen. After prison, Matza tried to create distance from the life that had defined him. He changed parts of his public identity. He tried to move into legitimate business. He built relationships outside the gang world, and according to testimony, attempted to live mostly clean. But the Aryan Brotherhood does not recognize mostly clean. It recognizes loyalty. It recognizes obedience. It recognizes whether a man answers when he is called. That is the part outsiders often misunderstand. In that world, release from prison does not mean release from the organization. A man can leave the yard, leave the cell, leave the daily rituals of custody, and still remain attached to orders that can reach him from behind walls. Madza learned that the hard way. According to federal court proceedings, he was later pulled into an alleged murder conspiracy targeting Michael Thumper Tripp, a man he knew personally. The order placed him in an impossible position. If he obeyed, he would be dragged back into the violence he claimed he was trying to leave behind. If he refused, he could become the next liability. That is not freedom. That is ownership. And when ownership becomes unbearable, people make decisions that once seemed impossible. Maza went to the federal government. He pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, but then he did something almost unthinkable inside the Aryan Brotherhood world. He cooperated. He gave information. He testified. He explained how P9 had become tied to the Brotherhood, how status had become control, and how the promise of power had turned into a cage. On the stand, he did not pretend the choice was safe. When asked about the consequences of testifying, his answer was direct. He believed he would be hunted for the rest of his life. That sentence reveals the final truth of this world. There is no clean exit. There is no retirement ceremony. There is no moment where the organization thanks a man for his service and lets him walk into a normal future. Public Enemy number 1 lost both of its founders in different ways. Stringfellow lost his life on a prison yard. Maza lost the protection of silence and became a marked man in the eyes of the world he once joined. One founder was killed because he was seen as a liability. The other testified because he realized he already was one. And if the only choices left are kill, be killed, or talk to the government, then the question becomes impossible to avoid. Was there ever freedom in this life at all? Public Enemy number 1 began with noise. Guitars, drums, crowded rooms, young men throwing themselves into the chaos of a scene that promised identity to anyone angry enough to claim it. For a moment, that noise must have felt like freedom. But freedom without direction can be captured. Rage can be recruited. Belonging can be weaponized. And a gang that begins by rejecting control can still become a servant to a system more controlling than anything it once claimed to hate. That is what happened to P9. The music faded. The streets took over. Then the prisons took over the streets. And finally, the Aryan Brotherhood took over the men who thought they were building something of their own. By the end, Public Enemy number 1 still had a name. But a name is not independence. A tattoo is not freedom. A reputation is not control. One founder died on a prison yard. Another testified knowing he might be hunted for life. The younger members kept filling the same machine, many of them too late to understand what had already been lost. They started with noise, rage, and the promise of freedom. But by the end, the only sound left was the prison door closing behind them.